So a few days ago I made a video about Australian and New Zealand based fighters that could be signed to the UFC to make their debut on UFC 284. Today I'm going to be doing the same sort of thing about UFC Fight Night South Korea. In my opinion, this is a great opportunity for the UFC to sign some fighters from South Korea, from Japan, from China and that sort of area to make their debut in an arena in front of a crowd, in front of a home crowd in South Korea. So this is what I'm kind of doing here. I've got a list of fighters here that to my knowledge are not on an exclusive contract. That's pretty important because there's a lot of great fighters but they're signed to Bellator, they might be signed to ONE FC, they might have an exclusive contract under Ryzen. So to my knowledge these guys here are all free agents and the UFC could pick them up today and put them on this card with an opponent. So that's what we're going to try and do. So the first fighter here is Han-Seol Kim. He's got a 13-4 record. This guy is a no-brainer signing. He's the number one in this video. It's not really in an order, but the first few fighters are the first few fighters for a reason. After that, it kind of tails off to just a bunch of random fighters that I think that would fit into the UFC roster. But Han-Seol Kim's my number one guy. This guy is most likely, out of everyone in my opinion, to be signed to the UFC. I mean, he won on the road to UFC in a bonus fight over John Adajar. And he's also got a first round finish over Seok Kyung-ho, who had a 7-1 record at the time. He finished John Adajar within 1 round. This guy's an exciting fighter. He's from South Korea. He's a welterweight as well. And he's 32 years old. So if they're going to sign him, they've got to sign him now. It's not like they can give him a couple of years to develop and get better. He's 32 years old. He needs signed today. He needs signed right now. He got a first round finish over John Adajar on road to UFC. This guy's a no-brainer signing. I wouldn't be too surprised if we see him. Now, Makoto Takahashi, he's from Japan. He's 15-1 record, 15-1. And he's just a great fighter. You know, he doesn't have too many wins by finish. He's got 12 wins by decision. But I don't think that should put the UFC off at all. Because this guy's a flyweight. The UFC needs flyweights. Like, when I say the UFC needs flyweights, the UFC needs flyweights. Flyweight right now is arguably one of the most exciting divisions in the UFC right now. And they've only got like 30 fighters or so, 35 fighters I believe off the top of my head signed to the UFC in their flyweight division, whereas like welterweight, they've got like 70 fighters in welterweight, they've got like 70 fighters in lightweight. They need to start signing flyweights, and they need to start signing flyweights right now. So let's start with Makoto Takahashi. He's from Japan. He recently won in America over Diego Paiva, who I believe is a Damian Maia prodigy or one of the or something like that. I know he's a prodigy of a very famous Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter. He beat Diego Paiva by finish in the 4th round, and he's beaten a lot of great opponents as well. You know, 12-3, 13-6, 8-3, and 35-30. Makoto Takahashi is a great grappler, and his striking's pretty good as well. I like Makoto Takahashi as a signing for the UFC. 15-1 record at 22 years old. This guy really could make an impact, and he could do something. So I like him. Another fighter that I like is Jung Hyun Lee. He's got an 8-0 record. This is a guy that Chris Prisnell from MMA Ecosystem on Instagram and Twitter talks about a lot. I think he's like, I don't know, I'm not gonna speak on his behalf, but from the amount of times that I see him bring him up, I think that this guy might be one of MMA Ecosystem's favorite prospects. He talks about him all the time. He's only 20 years old. And also, he's a flyweight. Like, as I said, the UFC needs flyweights. That makes sense to me. The only reservations that I do have about this guy is the level of competition that he has been fighting. It's not super high, but he has been looking good doing it. He's got many finishes in the first round by KO. The UFC loves people that can KO people, especially at flyweight. He's 8-0. He's been built up by Road FC, fighting increasingly more difficult competition over time, I guess. Like, he's beaten a lot of guys with losing records, but that's not really the point. The point is that I think that maybe this guy's UFC ready. Chris Prisnell seems to think so. 8-0 record from flyweight, from South Korea. What more could you want? It makes sense to me. Tatsuya Ando, 13-3 record. And the reason why I like this guy so much is the level of competition that this guy has fought is very high level. He's a bantamweight. He's 32 years old. If they're going to sign him, they've got to sign him now. Once again, you can't let this guy develop over the next couple of years because he's 32 years old. They've got to make something happen now. This guy has beaten a lot of very good competition. He drew with Ryo Okada and then he beat him. The one loss he's got recently, the one loss he's got in the last, 6 years was to injury. He lost to right leg injury. And then he come back and beat a 15-3 opponent. He's beaten an 11-1 opponent, like 10-4, 10-3, 14-7, 16-7 earlier on in his career. Like, we're talking about good levels of competition from this guy. He's from Japan. He's a bantamweight. UFC does kind of need bantamweights because it's such a stacked division. I think he would make a splash. And also the UFC's really trying to build up some Japanese prospects. I think Tatsuya Ando just makes sense. Sifo Shang is another fighter which I think just makes sense for the UFC to sign. Mainly because he's a flyweight. He's a flyweight. He is pretty old though, to be fair. He's 36 years old, which is maybe why the UFC would have reservations about signing him. But the UFC is trying to build into the Chinese market. And you've got a flyweight with 42 professional fights. There's not many flyweights out there that have got this many fights, and I think Sifo Shang would make a splash in the UFC's flyweight division, you know. Like, he did lose to Juan Puerta by split decision, and Juan Puerta unfortunately has gone to lose a few fights, but Juan Puerta is a very good fighter on the regional scene, and since then he's beaten a 23-9 opponent and then an opponent with a losing record, but even then, like, he lost to Juan Puerta by split decision. It was somewhat controversial, but I do completely understand why Juan Puerta won. Sifo Shang, he's pretty well-rounded as well. He's kind of got everything going for him. If they're going to sign him, once again, they have to sign him now. This guy's 36 years old at flyweight, and he's experienced at flyweight. 42 professional fights at 125 pounds. You're not going to find that anywhere else. I don't think you could find anyone else with 42 professional fights or more at flyweight. I think Sifo Shang's just a guy that the UFC should sign. I believe he was on a crazy win streak as well before that fight. Yeah, he was. He was on a 20-fight win streak before he ran into Juan Puerta. This guy's legit, man. I think he should get signed to the UFC. I think it just makes sense. He's also 5'7" at flyweight, which is pretty tall compared to a lot of other guys. I just think it makes sense, man. I've been singing this guy's praises actually ever since he was announced to fight in Dana White's Contender Series. Then I found out who he was, and ever since then, I've kept my eye on him. He's old, I know he's probably going to retire in a couple of years, but realistically, I think the UFC should sign this guy. It makes sense. Now, the next few fighters here, these are fighters that may not get signed to the UFC. Maybe they go in Dana White's Contender Series or something like that. But a South Korean fighter, Yong Yang, he's a bantamweight. And the UFC kind of needs bantamweights because of how stacked it is, and he does be fighting some pretty good competition. He is in Ryzen, so maybe there's an asterisk there. Maybe he's got an exclusive contract under Ryzen. We don't know, but he is fighting good competition. You know, when he was 3-0, he fought his 3-0 opponent. He fought a very experienced 19 and 16 opponents the next, and a 23 and 12 opponent when he was 5-0. And he's finishing these guys. You know, the UFC likes finishers. He went undefeated as an amateur as well. I think Yong Yang makes sense potentially as a sign-in, maybe a Dana White's Contender Series in the future. He is 26 years old, so he does have time to develop. C1 Park is 7-0. In my opinion, this guy would make another great addition to the UFC's roster. He's a lightweight. He went 4-1 as an amateur. He's gone on to defeat a couple of decent opponents recently in the first round by KO. 4-0 win in the first round by KO. 3-0 win in the first round by KO. Once again, maybe not proven enough to be signed straight to the UFC. Maybe a guy you do want to put on Dana White's Contender Series because that's what the show is for. But I think C1 Park, you might see this guy in the UFC. Maybe one FC or Bellator at some point. He is a pretty cool prospect from South Korea. Su Young Yu, 9-2 record, 26 years old at bantamweight again. And he's also got a couple of good wins on his record. There's one loss recently was to Sebastian Kamadov, who's now been signed to Bellator. He won his Bellator debut in the first round by KO over a very experienced opponent. And I think Su Yu Young, maybe once again like a guy you want to put on Dana White's Contender Series, but he does have a pretty good win in the fourth round over a 12-4 opponent. It'd be interesting to see what they do with him. Maybe you see him just straight in the UFC. Maybe Dana White's Contender Series, but a South Korean prospect to be aware of. Another situation here where I think that Shui Yin, he could be signed directly to the UFC, but I think once again it would make a little bit more sense for them to put him on Dana White's Contender Series. And a couple of years ago when Sifo Shang fought on Dana White's Contender Series, they actually put a lot of Chinese fighters on the 2021 season. This year you saw a lot of Brazilian fighters on the 2021 season. Maybe they go back to putting a lot of Chinese fighters on Dana White's Contender Series, and maybe Shui Yin could be someone that they put on there. Once again, a flyweight, and I just can't say it enough. The UFC needs flyweights, but the UFC also needs heavyweights. But the difference between UFC's the flyweights and the heavyweights is there's a lot more talented flyweights out there waiting to be signed compared to the heavyweights. There's actually not that many heavyweights out there. And this guy, you know, he has been fighting decent competition, but not so great competition at the same time because of the nature of the promotion that he fights for. JCK Fight Night is actually a tournament. Their whole thing is a tournament sort of style like PFL, except they don't do a playoffs. They just do like brackets. and he's been doing pretty good. Shui Yin, you know, he's beaten good competition. He beat a 19-4 opponent there. He beat 9-5 opponent earlier on. Since then, he hasn't been fighting the best competition, to be fair. But as I said, it is a tournament style, and he has lost earlier on in his career. But since then, he's on a big win streak. He's beaten great opponents. Might be a situation where you put him on Dana White's Contender Series, as I said earlier. But 15-3 record, definitely nothing to joke about. And he's also from China, which is very close to South Korea. So maybe you see him signed, but maybe not. Another situation here, Sun Lang Ixi, or Sun Lang Lixi. 13-1 record. He's actually fighting at strawweight at 115 pounds, and he's 5'6", so he's a very thin guy to be making 115 pounds and 5'6". We do know that we don't actually have a 115 pound male division in the UFC, so this guy would have to fight at 125 pounds, and I think it's just another situation where you can keep your eye on this guy. I don't think he's going to get signed to the UFC soon. I think he's going to be another Dana White's Contender Series product, or maybe just a guy that just keeps grinding away in the regional scene, and then we see him. I don't know how old this guy is, but I'm assuming he's not too old because he hasn't been fighting in MMA for super long. I'm assuming he's mid-20s, and I think maybe it's just a guy that we see develop over time. Maybe Dana White's Contender Series prospect. He hasn't fought for over a year, so maybe he's not into fighting anymore. Maybe not, I don't know. But I saw this guy and I thought he's definitely worth just someone bringing up as a potential prospect in the future. The next one here is Yuma Horayuchi. If you know who Yuma Horayuchi is, he's another fighter that hasn't got the best record, but the level of competition that this guy has fought is very high level. But he doesn't have the best win-loss record recently, but it just does come down to the very high-level competition that he's fighting. Split decision loss to Charles Johnson, who's in the UFC now. I lost to Topno Karam, who is on road to UFC. And then he beat Juan Peretta, who I was just saying, is actually the guy that beat Sifo Shang by split decision on Dana White's Contender Series. It's actually the same guy. He lost to Yuma Horayuchi, and he beat Sifo Shang. But, with that being said, I think Yuma Horayuchi may be too much too soon right now. Maybe you see him on Dana White's Contender Series next year. He's only 25 years old, 10-5 record, not that pretty, but the level of competition this guy is fighting is very high level. A win over 6-0 Mark Calamarco, a win over Donovan Freelo, who's a guy that you might recognize because I believe off the top of my head this guy has fought a few fighters that have made it into the UFC. Shannon Ross is now in the UFC. Ricky Simone is now in the UFC. I'm not too sure about these other fellas, but anyway, there's two fighters that this guy has lost to that are in the UFC, and Yuma Horayuchi. Now, speaking about the guy that beat Yuma Horayuchi, Topno Karam, big long shot play here. I mean, he lost on the road to UFC to Hyun-Suk Park on the semi-finals. But the thing about Topno Karam is he's such a good striker, and this guy just has the personality to be a star. Like, just watch this guy walk out to his road to UFC fights. I genuinely just recommend, even if you don't watch his fights, watch his walkouts. This guy is hilarious. This guy is so funny, and he's even doing interviews and he's like saying stuff. Like, he was in the middle of his fight, he was literally fighting Yuma Horayuchi here, and he was like yelling at the cameraman. He was yelling at people in the crowd when he was fighting. He walks out and he like stares at the camera. He's just a hilarious guy. Like, yes, he lost in the first round to Hyun-Suk Park, but that just come down to really bad fight IQ, to be honest, because he knocked Hyun-Suk Park down, and then at some point they ended up on the ground and he got submitted. But he really could have finished Hyun-Suk Park early on in that fight. But the point is, I think Topno Karam is just a guy that you could see signed straight to the UFC. Like, it just makes sense because this guy's so entertaining. This guy's got it in him, man. This guy's got star power. You know, he doesn't have a good record, but he's got star power because he's hilarious. And I think that this guy could really cater to just both the Asian market and also the American market, just with how likable he is. Like, he's hilarious. I know he doesn't really deserve to be signed to the UFC. He's literally 2-3 in his last 5. But he did beat Yuma Horayuchi, who's on my list, and he did lose to Hyun-Suk Park, who's going to get signed to the UFC anyway because of road to UFC. Star power right here is really the only reason why you would sign Topno, and then you would give him a very favourable matchup to make his debut, and then you'd give him the mic, and he's just hilarious. This guy's hilarious. I don't really know how to explain it. He's just so funny. But yeah, that's my list, man. I think Hyun-Seo Kim is the most likely to get signed off this list. Other than that, I think Makoto Takahashi is pretty likely. I don't know if the UFC is that interested in Sifo Shang because of his age, but he did go on Dana White's Contender Series, so you do know that he is on like their radar at least. And apart from that, you've got Tatsuya Ando, who I don't know if he's on the UFC's radar at all, but the level of competition does speak for itself. And Zhang Hyun Lee, 8-0. MMA ecosystem keeps talking about this guy. And I think you're going to see this guy in the UFC one day. I don't know if it's going to be in only a few months' time, but I think it would make sense. I think it is a signing that does make sense. So, yeah, that's kind of my list of fighters that I think the UFC may have their eye on. They might have completely different fighters on their eye on to maybe sign for this card. But hopefully we see a couple of these guys on this card, because a lot of them are very deserving. In my opinion, I think Sifo Shang's very deserving of a UFC contract. I know he's 36 years old, but I just can't get it over that experience, man. Like, the level of competition, once again, isn't great. But the UFC just needs flyweights, man. The UFC just needs flyweights. They need them. So, yeah, that's good. Yeah, tomorrow I will probably make a video about, once again, the PFL signings, or the PFL scouting for next year. Fighters that the PFL should sign if they want to make a big splash. And, that's it, man. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.